Jacob Temple. I'm the president of the society, and I hope everybody can hear me and hear these people during tonight's presentation. At a board meeting last fall, we were talking about what are we going to do for programs for the rest of the year. Jack Downing reminded us how we drew big crowds. We had bigger crowds than this last time. Maybe it's the rerun that depresses the attendance. He was reminded us about the big crowds and how everybody had such a good time when we did it growing up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Did we do? I don't know if we did 80s or not. But
they were great though.
They were pretty good. Everybody had a good time. And you can imagine what happened next. We started remembering the different, some of the anecdotes. And then as the enthusiasm built, everybody looked at Jack and cornered him into doing the encore program, the MC. The lifelong Medfield resident, they approved it.
Close.
Well, not yet.
We're not going to call you a town again.
But at least an honorary townie.
Just before we get going with the panel itself, just want to try and lay a little bit of background. As I started researching this, after I got volunteered to organize it, I started to realize the 50s were really that was probably the decade that serves a big foundation really for the way Medfield is today. Really, there was a lot of change going on. The biggest thing that jumped out at me was the changes in the population. The population grew beginning in 1950 from about 4,500 to just about 6,000. So it grew about 35%. That's actually tempered by the fact that including those statistics of the hospital population. The patients up at the hospital were included in that too, and that actually shrunk during the decade. Where you really see where the growth was starting to explode was in the student population. It started out with about just a little under 500 students, about 484, and by the end it had grown to 932, so it just about doubled in population during that one particular decade. The other thing that was interesting was school expenditures tripled. It was started as a whopping $90,000, and it was just about $300,000 by the time the decade ended. What we were seeing was the first influx of people moving in from the city and so forth, and they had to have places to put them. They had to, housing. So we started to see the first developments here in town. Probably the most prominent one at that period was right off of Lowell Mason Road, Johns Avenue and so forth. What at the beginning of the decade had been one big vacant field was filled with people by the end, families by the end of the decade. The center of town started to change as well. Probably the most prominent change that we saw was Lord's. The original Lord's store was knocked down in 1957, and that bright red neon sign became the entryway into Medfield after that. Finally, we also started to see the introduction of organized activities for youths during that decade. Beginning, you had the Little League, for the kids to play baseball. By the end of the decade, you also had the Iversons moving into town and organizing the drill team. So we started to see, nothing of a scale like we see today, but you started to see the organization of youth activities for the kids. So all in all, it was really a decade of change. So we have 5 people here who grew up during the decade, and I'd like to introduce them. Okay, starting over here is Tom Sweeney. Tom's a lifelong resident of Medfield, grew up in the Harding section, worked for the state for a number of years, and now he's a fixture about town working in real estate. Marge Vasaturo, again, another lifelong resident. She was a teacher in this, grew up here, went to Boston College, was taught for a number of years, has been a resident, what have you been there, 55 years?
If I tell you how long, you'll know how old.
Not in the town, but over on Emerson Road.
55
years, been a resident in Emerson, yep. Okay, this is Nancy Frame Sedin. Did I get that right?
You did. It's
Oh,
so hard.
Well, that's because Marge gave me the wrong name the first time. And she grew up here in town. Later became a teacher in Walpole, I think it was, you said. And she's actually come up here from Cape Cod. She moved to Cape Cod 30 years ago, you said? Or 40?
3 years.
Okay, 40 some odd years ago. And she's been a resident ever since. And she's come up from the Cape to share her stories with you tonight. Bob Curry. Bob literally grew up at the very end of Green Street. Okay? There was, for those of you that know Green Street, it ended at a stone wall back in the 50s. And his house was on the left just before you hit the stone wall. After that, with a pass up to Rocky Woods. And so Bob grew up here, went to school in Medfield, been back here for a number of years. You probably all know Harry. Harry grew up on what they used to refer to as Green Street Extension. Okay, it's now Newport Lane. Yeah. And he's been a resident of town for many years, was a former selectman and so forth. So I'm going to turn this over to you folks, really just to pass back your memories and so forth. I might start out by asking maybe each one individually if there's some recollection, maybe what's the best memory you have maybe of that time, and so forth.
Well, I moved here in 1959, I think it was January, from Norwood, and quite frankly thought my father would have to build a log cabin to come and live in Mayberry here. But thank God, Bob Curry, the first guy I met on Green Street, became my first friend, and to this day, I'm proud to have him sitting here. It was really cool. But one of the funny things I remember, I don't think I've told before, is that I was 11, just turned 11 when I moved here. And I used to love to fish. So one day, I was probably 12 years old, I dug some worms, got my fishing pole, and walked through the woods where the current swim pond is now on Green Street. But it was just woods and stream and so forth back then. So here I am, fat, dumb, and happy, a little stream, couple of worms. And these twin brothers came up to me and asked me if I had a license and roughed me up a little bit. And so those of you who don't know Jimmy and Joe Horgan, there they were, welcomed me to town, and that's how they did it. So I'll leave you with that thought and come up with something while someone else is talking. So I'll pass the mic to Bob.
Thank you. Harry and I are really the junior people on this panel.
Thank you, Bob. All right.
Gary Jr.
But I was the youngest of 7 to graduate and go to Medfield schools, so I was well known before I knew the other people. But anyway, very fond memories growing up in Medfield. It was a very sleepy town when we were young, and we watched it grow into quite a large town. And I think most likely it was the 128 being enlarged and all the new industry coming that caused Medfield to expand the way it did. So I think the 50s really was a time of growth, and for, I think, all of us, very fond memories.
Well, we moved up from Philadelphia after my dad, I started to say graduated, finished with the Navy in '46. And my parents bought the big house down on Main Street on the right going towards Millis. It's called the 1680 house, I guess. It's a big, you pass it. And it was a marvelous place with a great big field and woods and bordered the cemetery with a brook in the back. And I have a million memories, but one is after the hurricane of '38, a lot of trees had fallen along the brook that goes into the cemetery that runs out of, I guess, Baker's Pond, doesn't it? And there were all these logs that were like this. And so Marcia Newell lived across the street from us, and her parents had the livery service, and her uncle and her father drove the school buses. And so Marcia and my brother and I would go down and walk along the logs. And we would always fall in. And I'm sure my parents wouldn't have cared, but we were decided that they would. So Marcia and I would send my brother up on the shed in the back of the house and through his bedroom window to let us in. And I think my mother was probably watching us the whole time. And the other thing is that because the school was so tiny, there were 27 kids in our class. So we did everything together. And because we had the biggest living room, I have too many memories, but we had all the class parties in our living room. And my brother was a brat, and he was 3 years younger, and maybe his name was Peter Frame. And everybody liked him, but except for me. And we were having a class party one night, and I was dancing with this guy I really liked, and all of a sudden everybody screamed. And because the house was old, upstairs they'd never had any heat, so the way that the heat would get to the upstairs, I think we had about 5 fireplaces. Every room downstairs had a fireplace, and they'd have registers above the fireplace, and that's how the hot air would go up and warm the bedrooms upstairs. Well, Peter had taken the register out of the spot that it fit into the floor and inserted his head. And up there, hanging from the ceiling, was this fat little head with his tongue sticking out. Anyway, your turn.
Oh, God.
Thank you, Nancy, but I cannot top that one. Some of my favorite memories of Medfield are of Rocky Woods. Oh, yeah. And it was just, for some of you who were here at the time, that's where we learned to skate. There was a ski tow, hot chocolate, and your parents could drop you off in the morning and come back. It was literally one of these places they come back and pick you up for supper, because Tom Sweeney's father, Tom Senior, would be there collecting the money, making sure we all behaved, and cooking the hot dogs and the hot chocolate. So Rocky Woods was a great place, and I think it's a loss that it's no longer operating the way it was.
Now that you know my name is Tom Sweeney, I get in trouble every part of town. It's not only in the north end of town, down in the east town, west of town, and south of town. It was one of those things where at the hospital, every person knew me because when I went up there, I always rode my bike or walked. And the main entrance, you always walked up, and the telephone operator, who knew everybody, knew what I was doing, where I was going, where I would be, because my mother would go looking for me. She'd call the operator, and she'd say, Tom just went down to the farm, or Tom went over towards the river. And she'll hesitate, and she'll say, well, check down the powerhouse, because his grandfather's down there, and that's where he'll be. So that's how it would be going Medfield. It was, I could never, I did get in trouble, but I got a lot of, supervision, right? Went to bed many a night early during the summer, which I didn't like. But it was one of those towns where I could run the fields. You could go right out of my backyard, and I could run right there to the hospital. And all through those areas, when the barns were there, the different places that we used to hide out, and we built cabins, we built caves, we built everything. And my wife says, you can't build anything today because you can't do anything with a hammer. But that's today. But kids had a lot of fun back then, and we all did. And that was Medfield. And I think some of the kids today do have the same. The Scouts are active here, I know, and they do a lot of great things. And we were all Scouts, and that's where Scouts in the north end of town went to the state hospital in the farmhouse, and that's where we had our cub meetings. And then Mr. Nowers, who was the head farmer, became the Scoutmaster at the United Church of Christ. And we had a great troop. We traveled all over the place with him. And that's what my greatest memories were. I'm going to pass it on to somebody who maybe get some more.
Was that operator Marge Ferris?
No, even before it was Sadie Mafusi. Yeah, Sadie Mafusi. Yeah, oh no, downtown they knew me too. They stick out their head out the window and say, there goes Tom again. Because you were known by the telephone operators. One knew you. My mother was a telephone operator up there, by the way. Yeah, that's how she met my father at the state hospital. Yeah. So it's, that's, when you look back, how people met each other, became romances come out of this place. My mother drive. My father never had a car till they got married. My mother picked him up everywhere. Literally picked him up, see? Teacher? Oh, teachers. Oh, they were all my favorites. Laura Smith, especially. I was just reading the book here. She was one that I had French class with in ancient history, world history. And I used to sit in one spot, and there was a girl in front of me, a girl behind me, a girl over here, and a girl there. And every day that we went to class, Miss Smith would say, Mr. Sweeney, how's your harem today? But she had a great sense of humor. Believe me, and I really appreciated it, and she appreciated my little humor that I had. I know Mr. Macklin used to sneak in the back door. He used to oil the knobs on the doors. He'd sneak in because he'd see if somebody was raising Cain or doing something or making faces or whatever it was. And I got called down one time for doing something, but but that was it. But she was of all the teachers I had, she was the person I really enjoyed through high school.
Where was the switchboard?
At the hospital?
Dover, it was right over the Dover Drive. That's where our
Well, the switchboard was down here in Medfield. Was it the big building in the center? It was faced on Main Street, and she could stick her head out the window, and she'd tell the cop where the fire was, when the fire alarm came in, same thing. And at the hospital, it was if you go up the road straight ahead up we call the Avenue, it was the A building administration, and she'd be right up there. So I was dead meat. She could find out anywhere I went.
Before we go on with teachers, Nancy wants to say more about telephone.
Just the telephone. When we first moved to Medfield, it was just a crank, and you cranked it, and then you'd lift up the headset, and you would tell the operator the number, and it would be like 349, and that would be the number. Our doctor was Dr. Park, and his number was 80. And so you just say that. And but you also lots of times were on a party line, so you never answered the phone unless you had the right number of rings. Well, you weren't supposed to. But my infamous brother and I found out that if you push the little whoozy, what's this, where that shuts the telephone off, you kept that down and you lifted up the receiver when it was somebody else's ring, and you could listen in on these very cool conversations from your neighbors. And the telephone office was in the center of town. I don't know what
Clements Road.
Over in Clements, yeah, it was. And Miss Brennan also had her piano studio up there, and it always smelled of peanut butter. Anyway, the telephone operators were up there, and one of the telephone operators was Miss Gardner, who lived across the street from us. And Miss Hersey, her roommate, was the librarian in the library in Orleans. Where am I? Medfield. And so my mother was dialing. No, she didn't dial. She did the phone thing one day, and she called. She asked the operator for the number, and the lady said, "Oh, Janet, she's not home right now. I just saw her walking by. Why don't you call her later?" So that would never happen now. I know. I'm sorry.
I have a little story to relate. It's not really about teachers, but it was happened when I was in the second grade. I have a few classmates here: Gloria Roy, Ed Beard, Billy McGregor, Harry. Anyway, I think it was in Mrs. McFusey's class, and I had invited Sandy Fraser, who was sitting next to me in class, home because there was nobody at the house. My mother and my sister Lorraine went to Boston to pick up her prom dress. It was the night of the prom. So Sandy and I get up to the end of Green Street, and last house on the street, we had a big field out back. We decided we were going to make a campfire. So we went out, got some matches, went out, and started a small fire and put it out. Then we decided to make a second fire. The second fire kind of got a little bit out of hand. I ran back to the house to get water. By the time I get back over in the field, there was a big fire going. And it was nothing but woods all the way to Rocky Woods from there. So Mrs. Milton next door saw what was going on, and so she sent Arthur over. And even Arthur came over with a shovel, and we had brooms, and we couldn't get the fire out, so Mrs. Milton called the fire department. Fire department came up, they pull in the yard, put the fire out, everything quiets down, and finally the folks show up. It's dark now. The folks show up, and in those days at Dale Street, there would be a reception at the prom, a receiving line. So my folks took me along. As we went through the receiving line, we got to Arthur Milton, and he said, "Mrs. Curry, big doings at your house tonight." And that was the first my parents heard about that, and I got a little bit of trouble that evening.
Well, it's good to know that back in the old days, each family seemed to have a letter-sized card hanging somewhere in their house with the fire horn number for every street, 221 Green Street. So we obviously, if we heard we'd be riding our bikes somewhere, and we'd say, "Oh, 221, that's Green Street, let's go!" And we'd ride like hell to wherever we thought the fire was. Usually it was nothing, but I was going to say that I probably told this story before, but I'll tell it again anyway. We're always looking to make a buck. For no school one day, snow, we'd go up and down the street, can I shovel your driveway, make a couple of bucks, and one day, it was probably Bob's idea, he said, we could probably make some money selling blueberries to neighbors, to get some jars and fill them up with blueberries, and there were plenty of wild blueberries growing down in the woods past my house. But they were small, and it took quite a while to fill up a quart jar, so probably I had the idea, I don't know, to put some blueberries in, fill the middle with leaves, and put blueberries around the perimeter on the top, and it must have been his idea, and then go sell them to our neighbors. And it's like, oh, and so I don't think that lasted too long because they pretty much figured we'd charge them a lot of money for a thing of leaves. But it was just a great time to grow up here. Like I said, I came from Norwood, which to me seemed like a city when I came here, to a town with no stoplights, and in the afternoon, the only cop on duty would pull a box out in the middle of the street and direct traffic, and it seemed like a wire coming out of the police station to a blue light on the telephone pole. So if a call came in, he'd see the light and stop directing traffic and go, answer the phone. And one of those days, when I was now in the 60s, had my license. It wasn't Bob, but a friend of mine and I had my father's big 55 Oldsmobile with about an 8,000 horsepower engine. And we were driving up to all the M towns one afternoon after school, and I used to we'd be driving, turn the key off, let it coast for a while, turn the key back on, it would backfire with a very, very loud noise. So the fellow that was with me decided to take his pocket comb and hold it as if it were a gun and hold it out the window. And if we saw anybody walking on 109 somewhere, I'd say, "Oh, turn it off now." We'd coast up and turn it on, and we thought that was just hysterical. Until we came back to Medfield, and George Kingsbury got off the wooden box in the center of town, pulled me over and said, "All right, where's the gun?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I got a call from every police station from here to Timbuktu saying you were shooting at people on the side of the road." But anyway, I think I should pass the microphone to Bob now. It's enough of that stuff. That was great.
Are we back to teachers now, perhaps? No, that's fine.
Let me just tell a story about Laura Smith. Just to follow on, I wanted to say when Tom said Laura Smith had a great sense of humor, I wondered if she had humor the day she pulled down the map that used to roll up, and I think someone had put a centerfold from Playboy in there. And I'm not sure she enjoyed that too much, Tom, but it wasn't you, we know. But
I must talk about Elaine Pederzini. She was just so wonderful. And as a matter of fact, I have a few old yearbooks, the Peak here, and Elaine Pederzini and her husband Gildo. And Gildo had the flower shop, which is now Levels. And Gildo and Elaine were just wonderful to all the students. And Elaine was very understanding and took a lot of time and had, in some ways, I like to think that maybe she influenced my wanting to be a teacher and influenced some of the things I might have done with my students, because she was kind of a hands-on teacher. You could do projects and she taught French and English, but French and Latin to us. To the two of us, I think.
That's right.
And you could you have French food, do all kinds of interesting things which everyone was not doing in those days. So she was just a classic in many ways and very influential.
God love her, she lived to be over 100, did she not?
103. 103. Yes, she lived to be 103. And I had the privilege and opportunity to visit her a lot near the end of her life. And we had just some wonderful times, and she kept telling me how surprised she was that I turned out as well as I did.
Touche. I have a Mrs. Pederzini story. If you'd like to.
Please.
Quick segue here. I probably shouldn't tell this one, but I don't care anymore. At this age, who cares? See, I'm leaving town, so I'll leave you with this thought. Mrs. Penazzini, she was a really wonderful woman. So one day in English class, I was sitting next to the late Calvin Fisher. Sorry, great guy. So I never did my homework. I don't know how I got out of high school. But anyway, Mrs. Pettazzini said to me one day, I should first tell you that being of Italian background, I probably heard every Italian joke ever known to man when I grew up. And anyway, so be that as it may, no one would ever do that. But one day Mrs. Pettazzini said to me, Mr. Pertoni, what is the meaning of the word execrate? And somehow, I don't know how I came up with it, I said, that's the way you keep a 12 a dozen of eggs in the execrate. And it's the only thing I could think of. Honest to God, she laughed too, and I graduated from high school. What a wonderful woman. So that's my story. Thank you, Mrs. Pettazzini. So.
Well, probably my favorite teacher was John Cuoco. No particular reason, but the class I probably learned the most as a young person was in 6th grade. I had Mrs. Fields, and she had a curriculum that ran pretty much the full year based on a trip to Paris. So we actually thought we were going to Paris. We did passports, visas, got our shots. I don't know if anybody else was in that class, but I learned more about Paris and world travel in that class than I think I ever did.
Oh, I loved Mrs. Pettazzini too. We had another teacher named Mrs. Warburton, Julia Warburton, and she taught science. She was a riot, and we always took senior trips to Washington, and so Mrs. Warburton went with us, and I think we laughed more with Mrs. Warburton than we got out of the historic places that we visited. But Cynthia Schwartz was a fabulous English teacher, and I don't know if she was there for too long.
She got married.
Yeah, she was somebody else, and then she became Mrs. Schwartz. Oh, you're right. Right. And it's because of her I became an English teacher, so one doesn't know how one's activities are going to influence people that we rub shoulders with. But
we hope for the positive.
Yeah.
Another teacher just came to mind was Ann Rossi. Ann Rossi, I had in elementary school, and I believe I had her in I think it was the 4th or 5th grade. And I'll tell you, I wish more teachers were around like her today. I always thought she was tough, but she was tough in a great way. You really had to be a gentleman in that class, because if you weren't, you heard about it. She'd really give it to you. But she was a good teacher, and she put a lot of people on the right track on learning the basics. And she's still living today. I think she's in her 90s. And I was talking to her niece the other day, and she said she's still got it. She can you could come up, and she knows who I am. So someday I'm trying to visit her. But other teachers are interesting people that I had. It's probably that influenced me a lot was Jim Morris, Freeman Frank. Yes, Freeman was one of the characters of town. But in those days, teachers lived in town, and they not only taught in town, but they worked in town on a second job. Freeman was a bartender at the Francis. He was a waiter down there. I kind of followed the bartenders, because Morris was a bartender at Natick, and then they were down the Cape, and Bob Hersey, another fellow that worked the different places. You had these people all over, and I always kind of went to the places because I liked to hear their music and just to talk in their times too, because we talked about their school, Natick, and so on. They went back into the 20s. Some of them, and that to me was very interesting, which I think a lot of the kids think a lot of these people today that were in the 50s and 40s were interesting. And they are, because they had their own way of doing things. But it was survival. And this is what today that I try to teach my kids. and they always taught them that they worked hard, were honest, and they worked their way up through the tough times. And this is what the teachers taught me was, whatever you do, that's the way you do it. And kids today are going to have it tough, believe me. There's no more Sunday dinner. They don't sit down and the family talks every Sunday. We still have Sunday dinner. That's what Harry said. You still have the Italian, Nancy did. She said, you still have the Italian dinner? Now my grandson comes. He's 2.5 years old. He loves meatballs. And my wife just beams when he comes through the door because she knows he's going to like something. And that's the kid. That's what kids really like us, that type of thing, no matter what ethnic foods and things and tradition. But we try to carry it on, and it's something I think that I'd like to hear, and moreover, some of the people here would like to talk about it.
I seem to remember, again, from coming to town, there was not much in the way of organized sports. But I had just played Little League in Norwood before I left, and as soon as I came to Medfield, I joined the Little League here. And, of course, I already told you Bob was the first friend that I met farther up Green Street when I moved here, welcomed me to town. And of course, I remember playing on a different team from Bob back then, and all I can remember is this lefty. Almost every time he get up, the ball went over the fence. I used to play the outfield, and I just kind of watched the thing go over the fence and say, "Thanks a lot, Bull." We call him Bull Curry. But it was such a simple time, and as you heard, Bob lived at what was then the end of the dirt road at the end of Green Street, which was some distance past what is now Kenny Road, and it terminated there. And from there was a series of cart paths or old fire roads or something that went just about everywhere. You go to Pine Street, you could go out to Main Street, and frequently we would walk to Rocky Woods. You could just, how we didn't get lost, I'll never know, because there were no signs, of course, but many times, maybe not necessarily Bob and I, but others of us would just set off to the woods and walk all the way to Rocky Woods, and we knew we were there when we saw the shingles on the pathways to keep the weeds down that came from Bird Machine or some Bird Shingles over in Walpole. And like I said, with no organized sports, I came to town, and after I was fishing in the woods, when the Horgans came to me a few years later, swimming at Kingsbury Pond had ceased, and those of you who used to swim there probably still have the leech bites. But in any case, soon thereafter, a bunch of citizens, perhaps Mr. DeSauger and others, I can't remember all the names, we somehow got organized to produce the swim pond on Green Street, which was looked like swamp, but there were springs there. So they cleared it all out and put some sand in there, and I can actually remember standing in it in about knee-deep water when it filled up for the first time, and you may remember as well. I was probably with Lee DeSauger or somebody, and it was quite a thrill to see that happen when it was just woods before. It was a big thing, for the town back then. But it was a simple time, and there wasn't a heck of a lot going on here, but I think I can actually remember some of the things we had that just disappeared. I'm pretty sure there was, well into the 70s perhaps, maybe longer, a bus that would come down 109 and take it to Forest Hills or someplace. But even before that, I seem to remember when I first came to town, there was a bus that went down North Street and over to Framingham or something, and it looked like a bus from the Andy Griffith Show. I'm one of those. So you could go to the movies in Framingham or something, yeah. And we used to have, and again, I'm a latecomer, but in the early...
That was a
Conley bus, was it? Yeah, yeah. No kidding.
Go from Norwood to Framingham.
To Framingham, yeah, imagine. Of course.
They had a run from Walpole to
Yeah.
Norwood, and then they had another bus that went from Walpole right over to Framingham.
Yeah.
So a lot of the kids went to, what's the Catholic school?
To Marion, yeah, yeah. Yeah, Marion, yeah. Oh, so nice to have that. I mean, those things were nice, but they're long gone. But something else I wanted to, I can't remember what I was going to say, but it certainly was a what?
We had movies.
Movies, yeah. And then we used to have, at least in the 60s when I was in high school, they used to have dances up in the town hall. We used to have Dick Summer from WBZ or Juicy Brucey Bradley or one of these DJs would come out and others, and we would up on the top of the town hall have dances up there, and that was a lot of fun. It was really a great time. And when didn't they have a spring floor up there, a spring-loaded dance floor? Yeah, back when you were in the one-room schoolhouse, Tom, probably, yeah. And
Basketball up there.
basketball? No kidding. Wow. But I was thinking once again today, as I drove out of town past the police station under construction for the city of New York, that how far we've come, budget-wise and elsewise, from when I moved to town and the police station was in the left-hand corner of the town hall with one person on duty and no streetlights, and to see that now and then the town garage and so forth, it's just amazing what's happened in this town from what seemed like a much simpler time. But we really, I don't recall any of us had ever gotten any serious trouble. You know, we were always playing kick the can or hide and seek or something else, or when the Kenny brothers came to town and decided to build a few spec houses on Green Street and to get enough money to go in and build Kenny Road and other places, there was always a pile or two of wood that was going to be burnt for scrap. So once in a while, some of us would go, I hope with their blessing, take a piece or two and make a tree house someplace. And it was just a lot simpler, as many of you know that grew up here or other towns like it. What a great place to live. Great memories, great place to grow up. Great people like Eileen Des Flynn out there. I always kid her about her name. But, you know, we lived on Green Street, and we used to, again, walk through the woods to the cart path down to what we used to call Parkinson's Pond, which was next to Walter Frank's house, coming in off Main Street. It was just a swampy pond, but, you know, that's where we'd play hockey before the swim pond went in, at least those of us in this neck of the woods. So we run home from school at night, or all weekend, we'd just go plow that snow if we had to, and we would skate there until we were just about to drop dead. But there were several of us that lived in the Green Street area, so I'm not sure which of you came up with the acronym of the GSHL, or the Green Street Hockey League. So with Bob Curry, Lee DeSauga, Harry Petoni, I don't know, Craig McIntosh, the late Craig McIntosh, and a few others. And that we have Donnie Clive walk in from Main Street, and I can't even remember the others that used. You probably, why don't you take it? You probably know who else showed up.
Well, we had a pretty good group.
Yeah,
Pretty good group of guys that showed up to play hockey all the time. But the cemetery also had a large contingent of kids who played hockey from the south end of town. And once a year would have a grudge match and hold it on Baker's Pond. And the kids would come up from the cemetery, would come down from Parker's, and it would be an all-day event to play hockey. But some of my fond memories were also taking the bus over to go bowling in Walpole, or the movies in Framingham. I can remember my brother Ronnie was graduated in 1947, went to the Mass Maritime Academy, and I can remember probably around 1950 going with Dad to give Ronnie a ride to 128, and it was just a stoplight. It's 2-lane highway, and just a stoplight from 109 crossing 128. So it shows you how far things have come. And like Harry said, we would go out in the morning, and you'd stay out all day. And you'd be, whoever's house you're at, you'd have lunch there, and your mother would know you're safe. You were never too far out of sight.
Well, this is an extension of the bus thing. The bus that ran from Boston to Milford, it did give us kind of some freedom, and I guess we thought a little sophistication. Because we could go in, you know, you could go into Filene's basement, and not that, I mean, that's where I got my prom dresses, but a lot of people went to Wellesley and got their prom dresses, but I got mine in Filene's basement. But that was fun, and I do remember, and Sue Kennedy Monroe was here, and I don't know if you were involved in this, but we went to Boston. I went with some of my classmates, some girls. We went to Boston to have our senior pictures taken. But we were supposed to come home, but we didn't. We went to see From Here to Eternity, which was banned. It was a banned movie. And it was just so wonderful. And it was one of the best things I ever did. And another thing is, we had Miss Ethel Hersey, as Nancy mentioned, who was a librarian. Miss Ethel Hersey was a graduate of Wellesley College. She was very proper. I'm not sure if she wore high collars, but almost. And when I was about 8th grade or 9th grade, I must have been 9th grade at least, I went in and I wanted, I asked her if she kept books put away. Do you
Yes,
remember that?
yes, yes.
And I asked her for a copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and she told me I couldn't possibly have that because it wasn't appropriate for me. So guess where I went the next Saturday? On the bus to Boston to Laureate's, and I think if I looked hard enough, I would still have my little copy of Leaves of Grass. So she inspired me to good literature. So.
Just as far as the movies, the movie house was right in the town hall,
Right.
and it was 16 cents for the matinees until you were 12, and then you had to pay 32 cents. So you tried to look small and young for a long time, but you'd go down every Saturday afternoon and you'd walk down. And speaking of walking, we walked to school. We walked everywhere. But if you could walk along and there'd be a car coming that would stop and pick you up and you'd hop in, and this was can you imagine letting your kids do this now? But you'd hop in and you'd say thank you so much, and they took you to school, and we had no idea who these people were. And then as far as going out in the country, Causeway Street was only paved a little ways, and then it was dirt, and it went up to Noon Hill. And from what I understand, I was a very, very good person, but some of the members of my class would go up onto Noon Hill, and that's what I understand was happening. And then also, the Charles River would overflow, and it would go all over the road, and it was very exciting. That's just a little side thing. And my friend Eddie Getchell, who lived, did any of you know Eddie Getchell? He came from Japan in junior year. His dad was in the service. And they lived down on Causeway Street. And he called me. He lives on the side of a mountain in Colorado. He's wonderful and went to MIT. Anyway, he called me, and he was remembering that he and Norman Rossi used to get rides. The school would provide a taxi to drive them way down where they lived on Causeway Street. I never knew that until yesterday. But anyway, those are little absolutely unrelated pieces of nothing.
And we also had 2 bus routes.
Oh yes, North Street bus and
North and South.
Yep. But most of us walked, I think.
And there was no Green Street bus, I can tell you that.
No.
And I had no boots or a rain hat or anything else. Who can afford that stuff?
Yeah, I just remember I went by taxi myself to kindergarten. Yeah, kindergarten. They came up and picked us up at the post office. Yeah, there was people used to walk there, going to kindergarten. Mother and father bring them down there, and I just walked across the lawn and got the taxi. That was just the kindergarten. Then we went school bus, and we were lucky up there. At one time, we had 2 buses. One went all the way to the hospital, and the other one went up Harding Street. They turned around and they came back. So if you missed one, you might be lucky that he'd pick you up. But a lot of times he didn't, and I walked. But when you figure it was only. It wasn't far. It was probably 1.5 miles. And he didn't. Most of the time, somebody would pick you up anyways, because they wanted you to get to school. And especially the truant officer, who was John Newell. Yeah, he was the truant officer, and he would check out 2 places in town. That was the pool room, and I was an altar boy at St. Edward's, and yeah, right. And we didn't have to go to school first thing in the morning. So Paul Seeley and myself, we had that. It was a good deal too. We made a few bucks at it. So he would meet me, and he really didn't want to go up there because his mother was keeping an eye on him, and my mother wasn't, no downtown, so I could go up this pool room, and I'd wait up there for a while. And I used to meet him at the Clement, and then we'd go over to church, and we'd have the mass for the person, whoever it was, and then we'd skip out of there and we'd take our time. And one time we went up the pool hall, and John, who was up there, and he was cleaning out the pool hall of a few of the fellas that were older than us. And he'd say, "What are you guys doing here?" I said, "Well, we just stopped in to see Mr. Wilkins." "Yeah, okay, we'll get to school." So he offered a ride, but no, we'll go right along. So and that was typical of down there. And I also was the altar boy for the state hospital too. the priest would pick me up at the house taxi. I'd wait out front. We'd go up to the hospital. It was, I believe, 9:30 up there. And I'd have Mass over there. And sometimes they'd bring me all the way downtown because you wouldn't have an altar pay for 10:30. So we'd do the 2 Masses, and then I would get a taxi right home to my house because the priest had to go back to the hospital for some other reason. But it was interesting, too, to how kids would get there because I went to 5 o'clock Mass on this last Saturday, and there wasn't an altar boy, an altar server, we call them now, at all. So I was kind of amazed about that. But you did things, but all the kids in churches that worked with the ministers and the priests and so on, and that was one of the things that I remember really in my heart, and I see today. Let's see, State Hospital. I spent so much time up there. They wondered if I was a real resident, and that's why when I went to work, it's funny because when I went to work for the state, I was an appraiser, so I traveled the whole state, and we had to value state-owned land, and I couldn't do Medfield because they had a conflict. So we'd go out to Northampton, East Hampton, we'd go to Westfield, all over the state. So I went to all these places, and we'd have to inventory the land. We'd go to the city hall, or town hall, and we'd get the records and say, and I knew what it was like. And I tell you, it was just like Medfield when I was a kid. And this was just in the 80s. And they were still living the dream out there. And they still are, really, in some places out there, which are really, really nice. And it was up to even the Fort Devens. I saw that demise out there, how they broke that down, and how the state, the federal prison out there where they have the bomber there. I thought we were out there too, and that whole thing. It's amazing what's out there, and that's that whole part of the country. And I call it country because it's within the state. It's a mass. When you go out west of Sturbridge, it is unbelievable. It's a different world. And you get out there in that corner up there where Vermont and New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, and Mass come together there. It's beautiful country. The colleges out there and the inns, the beautiful inns, which we had to go and take a look at anyways to check them out. And I learned a lot and saw a lot. And then I came down. We'd go up the Pike, and then we stay there overnight. And then we'd come back and work our way down through the Mohawk Trail, over the Mohawk Trail, and then down Route 2, come down through there into to the reservoir. And we did a lot of work around the reservoir too. At the time, the MBT, the MWRA, were taking land. They were planning to redo the tunnels, in which they worked them all the way from the reservoir into Boston, to the city. And we had to go and find the right-of-ways that they utilized. And some of them were underground, which we found out, and some of them were ground level. And they worked the tunnels in the different ways that they went because of the geography, because they could only go so deep because they would run into bedrock or whatever it was. And then in some of these places, they did, you saw the pictures of the Big Dig. Well, this was the Big Dig coming in from the west to bring the water to Boston. Boston's resource, which I learned about too, was the original resource was the Lake Cochituate in Natick. All those series of ponds, they all flowed into Boston, and that was the resource for Boston after the different things. And then it went out to the two reservoirs, the Quabbin, but before the Quabbin, there's another one there, Wachusett, the Wachusett Reservoir. That was the big resource. Then they had to build the land takings were the towns, the 5 towns they took out there in the western part of the state, and they had to build the big dam. That was huge, because I remember when my father took me out in there, and we went out there in 47, I believe, and you could be able to drive across the top of that dam, the Wachusett, It was open. Today, it's like a fort out there. You can't get near it. They built tank traps and everything. They're really afraid someone is going to let bomb it or dynamite it. The what?
Characters and characters.
Characters.
Here we go.
Well, there were a few.
Like they be talking.
They had a fella who his name was Babcock.
Yes. Oh, that's the one that came to my mind.
Yes, Babby Babcock.
Yep.
Well, and my memory of Babby was the time they tore down the Manor Inn. Well, Babby's inhabitants was at the attic of the Manor Inn, and somehow the place caught fire. And Babby was smoking up there or something, and all I can remember is we finally got they got the hook and ladder from Walpole to get to the third floor because the place was engulfed with smoke. Everything, flames were coming out of the roof, the whole bit. And I forget, it might have been even George Financy had to go up the ladder to get him, and he wouldn't come out the window. Finally, somebody walked up the stairs and walked him down the stairs after they got the hook and ladder from Walpole. And then, there were a few characters that I forget their names. Bobby's got a good one, I think. I can feel it coming.
There was a fellow named Dave Kelleher over in Pine Street. And for some reason, my mother really liked Davy. And so one day, I can remember he stopped by the house and asked if I was probably 4 or 5 years old, if I could take a ride with him. So he had a Model A or a Model T in those days. He put me up on the box of Ballantine Ale, empties, and we headed up into the woods, and he took the cart roads all the way over to Sherburne, because he didn't have a license, so he'd have to take all the cart roads to get over to Sherburne, where he would gas up and get his fresh case of Bally Ale, and then drove all the way back through the woods.
He used to cut down trees. He'd be drinking on a Saturday night especially. I grew up on Pine Street, but he would cut down trees in the middle of the night, and you'd hear the old dump truck, driving down the street with no muffler, pulling an entire tree down the middle of the night. Or he'd be dragging the cars up into the woods, and they were usually on their roof, and you could just see them scraping along the road, going up into the woods. Saturday nights, that was usually his night to howl.
Some of his old junk cars are still in the backwoods behind Pine and North Street.
Still some back there?
Still some back there.
Yeah, he had them all over the place.
And another thing that I can remember, Mr. Gorman, who lived on Green Street. I remember when I started to meet kids in town, but Mike Gorman's still a little younger than we, and I remember they had this long, thin lot that went way back off Green Street. And in the back there were various sheds and pieces of machinery and cars and so forth. And the first time I saw this thing, I couldn't believe it. He had what I thought was part of an old car. And instead of one of the back wheels having a tire on it, it had some kind of a thing that had this belt that came to another thing with this huge saw blade on there that he'd cut up wood and stuff. I mean, you're a young kid, you see something like that, you just say, my gosh, I didn't even think anything like that existed. But, necessity was a mother of invention back then, and none of us had a lot of dough. So just fascinating to see those kinds of things in a much simpler day. But great place to grow up, and still a wonderful town. So that's all I got.
Yeah, Mike's dad, Big Mike, I can remember him delivering coal as a kid, and he would pull up and pull around the back of the house, put the chutes in, and shovel the coal into the house.
Yeah. It was a thrill to watch listen to the coal come in the cellar window.
Worked for Gilmore.
Another one was Floyd Hours, too. Floyd was a guy that could do anything. I mean, you didn't have to have when he came around first, I worked at the Brickyard. That was another one of my adventures. And he could do anything. He could repair anything. Those machines down there, I don't know how old they were, but it was something that was handmade. It wasn't something that was, you sent away and bought the part. You made it. And these things just happened, and he was just a mechanic in his name, a mechanic. And besides him, I worked with Al Colantonio, another guy that was unbelievable too. He actually built a brickyard, a brick machine in the bottom of the old restaurant across the tracks here now, which is Noon Hill. And the machine was in the basement. And these guys used to come in from brick companies all over the country because he made this beautiful brick, and they couldn't do it. And I forget what he was making it per brick, but it was unbelievable price-wise. But and he'd taunt them. It was really funny because I'd be down there and they'd be going in there and say, "What do you think of this? How much you give me for it?" And they'd go give him some fantastic price and say, he'd go just walk around, go back in the shop. He wouldn't answer them. So we kept on, that brick machine was in that basement the day that they sold the building down there. And someone came in, and I think they got it for scrap. But it was something. They had belts and everything, the brick, all the sand, and the mix and everything went together. He made a beautiful patio, a block. And it was something that was there since, the building was probably built in right after the war. He had where the Vets package store used to be in the back of there. Between the Vets package store, there was a space probably about from here to about as long as this room, because then the restaurant would start there and went out to Main Street, the Medfield restaurant. And so on Saturday nights, us, the kids, everybody get in the car, we'd go to the movies. And they would show the movies on the back wall of the old package store. And then the Colantonio would have ice cream in there. They'd sell the ice cream and so on, and Coke and hot dogs. And
Tom, that was also the TV Spa.
yeah, TV Spa. That was the first TV in town, by the way.
TV in town was Al
Yeah.
Colantonio.
Yeah.
As you see the layout of the restaurant now, it's kind of when you walked in, I know they modified it all, but it's kind of where you went to the side door where the person greets you, and you used to face toward the park initially, and they had a screen up. I remember he had a magnifying glass in front of that TV. Was the TV?
Yeah, it was a
7 or 8 inches.
Yeah, and a 30-inch glass, thick magnifier.
You'd watch TV, and then you'd get a soda at the soda fountain, and then watch TV again and go home.
Yeah, there's another place, and I remember too. There was a woman who lived down on South Street. In the inaugural parade I saw was Eisenhower's 1950 on a television like that. My mother was friendly. They used to go to the races together. And she dropped me off down there, and I'd watch the inaugural there all day long, the whole bit. It was really something to see the whole parade, And those days, they were really something. The people marching then was the West Point cadets, the Annapolis, and then the bands from all over the country, and it was great. But it was all black and white. It wasn't color. We didn't see.
The little TV that he had at Spa, they decided they were going to make a color TV. So they got this piece of steps out there.
Right, that's right.
And blue, then I think it was brown, and then green, just so that you could see through it, and that was color TV.
In fact, I think he got a color wheel.
Oh, the thing that goes around?
Yeah, right, got a fan, I remember that.
Someone mentioned to me recently, said, well, when you went out to eat, where did you go? Well, we didn't go out to eat that much, in the 50s, certainly. But we would go to the Francis.
Yes.
And a treat, as Tom said, would be to go to the TV Spa. And then I think it became Ann's Kitchen. Is that the same place? Yes, it became Ann's Kitchen. And the only reason I know that, I looked through I went to the Historical Society and then to my own basement and looked through some old yearbooks. And the 1954 was the first yearbook that had any ads in the back of it. And that's, one of the ads was from Ann's Kitchen. So I guess at that point it had morphed into Ann's Kitchen. Oh, I'm sure, Ann's Kitchen, was that your restaurant?
No, mine was the Medfield Lunch.
Medfield Lunch, right.
But where was the kitchen? I forget.
That's right there.
Right there.
Oh, that was before us then.
Later became.
No,
Ned's.
that was, that's right.
The years became Ned's.
After us?
I don't,
Oh, then, Leo and Mel bought ours.
No, this was down on the tracks. It was Ann's Kitchen,
Yeah.
and it was Ann Kilcoyne. She came from Millis.
Yeah, I remember, but where was it?
It was right there.
TV Star.
TV Style.
Noon Hill Grill.
Ned's Coffee Shop.
I don't remember that.
I haven't,
Ann
now,
Kilcoyne, and then
I was eating at the
Sweet
Medfield Lunch.
Carlson. Sweet Carlson ran that too with his wife, Ann.
Yeah.
Ann Kilcoyne was her sister.
So what was the restaurant then on North Street where the real estate offices are? Where the real estate offices are on North Street, Main, sorry,
That was my
Main.
mother's.
That was your mother's,
They
okay.
bought it in 1944, just before the war ended.
It was a colonial.
And I think they owned it up to 55 or 56.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And
I don't remember.
that was the only place in town. Actually, Al's was only a soda fountain more than anything.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
But
my father had
Al's-
people lined up down the street because it was so small.
Yeah, but Allie's paper store at the corner house, that had.
That was down here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that had a
That was
counter
later.
and you could get coffee and breakfast there.
I would now be an audience participation, if it's okay, Jack, I have a question. In this yearbook from 1954, you know, when they do the accolades, the favorites, whatever, there are two people who got best drivers, and they are posed in a motorcycle with a sidecar. Does anybody know anything? Who would have had a motorcycle with a sidecar in those days?
Marlon Brando.
Well, yeah, he didn't, Harry, he didn't live here.
You didn't live here?
No,
Everybody else
no.
passed
no.
through?
I was going to say, I wonder if it would be Bob Flagg.
Could have been.
Well, he could have been Bob.
Yeah,
I never remember him having a sidecar, but he could have.
George Kingsbury.
George Kingsbury.
Kingsbury's had it.
Bonnie Chick had a motorcycle, it
Yes.
was motorcycle car, but I don't know if it had a sidecar.
No,
I
okay,
don't
well,
know
just
about
another, oh, and then, can I ask another question? This has nothing to do with recalling, well, it does have something to do with recalling the 50s, I guess. When I was in the Historical Society archives basement the other day, I came across a basket where somebody very carefully, for years and years and years, decades, recorded the weather, morning, noon, and night, and nobody knows who recorded the weather. I think Linda Pettazzini, who was the mother of Gildo Pettazzini, I heard that she had done it, but I don't know if anybody here would know, because it's a pretty interesting book. And do you know?
I think some of the weather is at the society has been done by Barbara Lee. Barbara Lee?
Barbara?
Oh, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's not, but there's a question mark, who did this on the
But I don't know if
package?
it's the one you're talking about.
But anyway, maybe some of you remember Hurricane Carol, which was
Oh, yeah.
August 29th, 54.
Right.
And I remember it because I was traveling from the North Shore and then took the bus from Boston, and there were trees falling down behind the bus, in front of the bus. And the bus driver said, you know, I'm just going to Milford and I'm not going out again today. And I got to Medfield Center, and Newell's taxi thankfully was there, and it was John Newell saying, I'm not going to, I'll drop you at home, and that's it. So I don't know if any, you guys are too young, but you can remember 54?
Oh, yeah, when I was in Norwood, I remember. And then Diane was the same year, wasn't it?
Yes.
Two big
It
earthquakes.
was-
They came consecutively.
3 weeks in a row.
Yeah. So that was a pretty
We were
exciting.
cut off from Millis.
Right, that was because they're flooded in shops, yeah.
And everything
So
was
other
flooded.
events that we had, so.
I had one sort of memorable event. I wasn't there, but I should have been there. my sister Jackie, I was helping her with the kids. She had some young ones. It must have been around 1961. And so she had to go over to Natick for some parts for her husband's auto body business. And we got halfway, and of course we got a flat tire, no spare. And I was supposed to be back at Medfield at 2 o'clock for confirmation rehearsal.
I filled in for you that day, Bob.
Well, anyway, the church got struck by lightning. The kids were in the church when they got struck, I think. I don't know if anybody here was there. I don't know.
Are you through? Honest to goodness, I can't believe you just said that. I saw a posting on Facebook within the last week of some Friar Medfield person. If I could remember the name, you'd all know who it was. And this person said he and another friend were going to confession at St. Edward's, and the kid was in the confessional when the lightning struck the thing. It was like, and the priest and they all ran out, and the other kid says, "What the heck did you say?" Oh my God! I have to go look it up and see who it was. It was the funniest thing I ever heard.
Was it Garrick or was it?
I don't know who. I can't remember. I'll have to look it up. What am I going to do?
It was 61. It'd be either Father Garrick or who's the guy?
Father Cadet.
Oh, he had the 58 DeSoto, yellow and black. And Father Garrick told him to get it out of town. His sister gave it to him when he got ordained in 58.
That's why I know what
And he used to like to go fast and it was.
Well, he used to take us up to the quarries, up swimming.
Oh, yeah.
Up to Milford. Yeah. We'd go up in the 58 DeSoto. Garrick was on vacation for a couple of weeks, so we'd get the DeSoto. And then we'd go up to the quarries swimming. And we're walking in one time, and a bunch of guys were working there, and they walked up to, nobody knew he was a priest, we all had bathing suits on. And they said, "Boy, put a roof over this, it'd be a hell of a whorehouse, wouldn't it?"
I remember the old Harding post office. Tom's dad and mom used to man and woman it back at Billy and I used to ride our bikes up to get plate blocks. Tom's dad, who was also Tom, was the postmaster there. Zip code 02042, I believe. Torn down several years ago. But we used to ride up there, and I think we were the only customers who ever went there. But Tom had a way, he had a connection with a congressman. And somehow we kept that post office open until Tom was ready to retire. So Bill and I got some great stamp collections just getting to know Tom. We'd go in and the place would always be totally empty. Right, Tom?
Well, the speaker of the house. Who was the speaker?
Joe Martin.
Joe Martin.
Joe Martin.
That was the last Republican speaker until Gingrich.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tom Sweeney knew Joe Martin really well. The other thing you had to do is, when I go to Rocky Woods, I would never pay. So you had to have these buttons. I remember there was a family button saying, and I forget how much they were, but I didn't have a lot of money in my family, and anyone would go up and Tom would be there, he says, "Billy, you don't pay." So you'd always let me in for free, and then he said, "Let me see those skates." So I'd hand him the skates, I said, "What the hell do you do with those skates? Let me have them." And he'd take them back and sharpen them and give them back to me, and he said, "Now don't ruin them like you always do." But every time, he'd always, I don't think I ever paid to get in, and I don't think every time they'd take my skates and sharpen them.
Bill, I think you've paid back for all with your beautiful, beautiful artwork featuring Rocky Woods. And I want you to know that it's a framed print of your Rocky Woods is in the hanging on the wall of my 3 children's homes. So if any of you haven't seen Bill's website, go to it.
Junkyard Artist, right?
Yes. .com. And also, of course, we know our own Tom here. It has done many wonderful sketches in Medfield that are hanging in many walls. So Nancy had something. There's just nothing.
Well, then I'll say it. It has nothing to do with the art, but you were talking about the church. And Marge and Pete and I were talking this evening about how in the public school, this is so different from now that last period on Wednesday afternoon, all the Catholic kids got to leave and go to CCD, and we Protestant people had to stay and do schoolwork. It never occurred to us to say anything except we thought it was crummy that we had to stay and do work, and they got to go to downtown, walk downtown, have a good time, and go to CCD.
And it was a good time. It was a very good time. We didn't always go to CCD.
Oh, really? Now we find out.
I remember it was your boyfriend, but I was just walking with him because he was a Catholic, not because I was interested in him, but he was my good friend. And the superintendent of schools was Mr. Roy at the time, and he had I think his car was blue, and it was pretty obvious, you know, and we saw the car, so we got behind a tree, but the tree was probably this wide, so we got caught. And I think after that I might have started going to CCD, but until that time, I mean, you know, a beautiful day.
Yeah, we're back at
school. So we took advantage of it. But
You mentioned the superintendent of school. One of our classmates from the class of '65 was Jim Blake, and his father Tom was the superintendent of school years ago. And talk about a small town. I can remember. I mean, who was I? You walked down if he was in the school and you were walking down the hall, he called you by your first name. I mean, you can't believe this stuff today. But when you mention CCD, I got to tell you this story. As I said several times, make you sick with this. We came from Norwood, and my sister and I had to go to catechism class at St. Catherine's, and it was orchestrated by the nuns. And I want to say the head nun was Sister Elvira or something close to that. And we were so thrilled to move to Medfield, I hate to say it, but just to get away from them. And the first day we went to school catechism class here, who do you think was here from Norwood? Was Sister Elvira. I think we wanted to move back to Norwood. It was I hate to say it, but that's enough. I shouldn't say anymore.
They heard you.
They heard me? What about the nun that rescued the guy in Rentham yesterday? Yeah, a tree and like stuck in the woods. That was pretty nice. Anyway.
Can I tell a Norwood story? That it doesn't. I don't think, maybe. But we never had pizza ever. We had never heard of it. And my boyfriend took me to Norwood, and the Norwood had a pizza. Venice, right. And that was the first time. And the only time we went a couple of times, but we'd eat it in the car. And I always thought pizza was purple because of I don't know what it was, but I never saw what a real pizza looked like. But isn't that funny to think we didn't know what pizza was?
I always knew what pizza was. Anyway, you remember when you mentioned Norwood? My wife and I were talking about this today to somebody, and not that it has anything to do with Medfield specifically, but you make me think. When I lived in Norway, we went down the flats to some shoe store to get, when you're in the 50s, when you're a kid, and you and your mother and the salesperson all put your eyes on this device to see your feet in the X-ray machine, which, of course, Buster Brown. And, of course, it didn't have any radiation shields, so your lifespan as a shoe salesman was relatively short. But I just happened to see a show on that the other day. What a faux pas that was, but it reminded me. You said Norwood about those old radio. You probably all remember, this thing, and it was you put your feet in there. Say, oh, look at my feet, and oh, by the way, you've got a tumor on your knee. But there you go.
Well, I don't know about anybody else.
Yeah, I was down the street.
There was one in Walpole Center too. The other thing about the early 50s that I remember was the delivery to the house. The iceman, the milkman, the bread man.
Fish.
Oh, wow. But those are fond memories because when the milk truck was there, you go out and steal a piece of ice.
And the fruit truck.
I don't remember.
Yeah, there was a fruit truck and a fish truck.
The fish was a fish guy from Norwood. Petey's fish.
And bread.
Frank McCauley with the insurance.
Like 26 cents a week.
And the doctor came to your house.
Oh, that's right.
We also had the junk man, and I was in competition with the Archbishop of Boston. And we had these paper drives. So I used to go around the neighborhood and take all the papers, not when they were having their drives, but I was all year long. and I would put the papers in our barn. I had something like, I believe, it paid my way to Boy Scout camp. I know that was 2,000 pounds of paper. Was the ton, right? That's a ton of paper. And the old barn was, thank God, it was old oak floor, hard floors, the old oak or whatever they were. And because there was no sway to it, because there were beautiful beams in there. But my mother would always say, you got to get it out of there. There's going to be a fire, going to be a fire. So finally he would come, and he was surprised because he didn't think I had that many papers. So he backed the truck in. He goes in, he says, where'd you get this? I got it around the neighborhood. You kidding me? He said, yeah, how long you doing it? For a year. But I used to get it. I used to go all the way to the hospital too, because I had the paper route too. So I used to tell them to save their papers, anything cardboard, and I would get a cart, haul everything up to the barn, and then he would come. But that's what it was. It was $9. I think it was $9. Was it $18 a ton or something like that? But paid for like a week at Boy Scout camp at that time. So. You did things like that, if you wanted to go, that's how you went. You had your little chores, and you put your money away, and then I would shovel snow for every little old lady on Harding Street, Hospital Road. Yep. He was a purveyor of blueberries, right? But the best one was, one time, was Margaret, Marge's brother Matt, and myself were buddies. And they used to go fishing, but spring day, for some reason, we go down the Harding Street to bottom, to railroad tracks to Mill Pond. So we were always playing around in there. There was always a boat there. We'd unleash it and go out and paddle around and so on. But then the brook would run down and go down underneath West Street. So we'd always go down there because after you're playing, you were sweating and so on. And it was one of those days. So the railroad had a well there, so we'd go down and get our drink of water. And then we'd go down the brook a little further. And we looked down, there was this glistening in the sun and the water. So one of the guys would put their arm down, whole quart of Ballantines. Not only one, but we found 6. So,
Sorry, my brother.
Yes. So we took the Ballantines, we put them in the cart, and we proceeded to go up West Street, home. And then we started going up Harding Street. So we decided we were going to pedal it. So the first house we went to Levi Taylor, who was a teetotaler. and he squealed on us. He called my mother up, and my father come running down the hill, confiscated the Ballantines, and that was the end of that. I mean, but better than that, we had an old refrigerator in the barn, and that's where he kept it. And maybe we had a sip of it, maybe just to see what it tastes like. But better than that, to talk about the old barn, we had my brother George, when he was born, like a lot of kids had a skin condition, and he couldn't have cow's milk, so my father bought a goat. So he had goat's milk. So the goat, we had, one day you'd have one goat, a week later you'd have 3 because you'd have twins. So there were 3 goats out there, and my mother would never give them away, my father, so we'd feed them. That was one of my jobs. So one time I went out to the barn, and this was the last goat we had, and Nanny was down and laying in there, tongue was hanging out. So I would go into the house and told my father, I said, the goat's not too good. I said, you better go out and check him. So he goes out to check him, and he says, I'll call up the vet. So he called up the vet over in Walpole, and I says, I don't think he's going to be. He said, no. He said, maybe you liven him up. Why don't you make him a hot toddy? So my father made a hot toddy, brought it out to the barn. He looked at the goat, looked at the hot toddy. Man, the goat didn't get the hot toddy. So the poor old goat died. And that was the end of the goats, but we always had some kind of animal around the yard there. And my brother was a great collector too. He ended up at 4-H, and he had the fighting cocks. Well, we had one who got mixed up with a bantam rooster. And I had the bell bottoms we used to have that was in the 70s there, I guess. late 60s. Well, I had a plaid pair. And I'd come out the back door in the morning. That SOB would fly across actually come across the driveway, and he hit me right in the bottom of the bell bottom. And it was a net, and he'd, get the claws in there, and he would rip. And he had those steel heels here too. He didn't have in the fine cock that had, but he would get there. He was unbelievable, relentless. Every time he go out there, my father, he would live up in a tree. We wouldn't pay any attention to him. He was mean. So he used to. One day he comes up there, and my father said, "You get out of here now." He was pecking at my father. My father's doing something at the door. My father turned around with a hammer, hit him, and he goes like this and walks away. And he said, "That's the end of him." Next morning, he's back there again. He couldn't kill that. He finally froze to death up in a tree. But these were the farm animals. It was the animal control officer was all we had up there. He'd feel unbelievable. But you had those animals. We all had them. My sister had brought Mary had a little lamb home one time. My father brought that to him too. He lasted about 6 months. Then he went off to the farm again. He butted my mother. Yeah, she was the chief cook before Sunday dinner. That was worse. But those are the animals we had. And they were fun when you were kids. And I see my grandson now over, and they have like a little farm and a barn. And I said, "I think you should have a lamb." My daughter says, "No lamb, only a cat. That's it. Don't say anything more." "How about a puppy?" "No puppies either." But it's great to see them when they have them. I don't know if anybody else has any animal stories.
All right, we'll wind it up. Just a quick one. Talk about how much simpler it was back then. I can recall it wasn't unusual for someone to have a .22 rifle or a .410 shotgun or something. And I had a .410 shotgun, and the kid next door, younger than I, had a .22. And it was nothing for us, under 15, I'm sure, to walk up to Arthur Will's and just say, "Give me some of those shotgun shells and .22s." And you'd go home, just go down in the woods yourself and shoot cans. And when I think of that kind of stuff today, it's so hard to believe. I'm just a kid. But amazing how far we've come, huh? Anyway, thank you all.
I just want to thank everybody first for coming, and also thank the panelists, because we could probably go on for another hour or so. But okay, again, thank you very much.
The preceding was a production of Medfield TV.